Great, thanks so much, Signy, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar today. I'd like to just start us off with some acknowledgements. This project was funded by the National Park Service Fuels Reserve Fund with additional funding support from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm also just grateful for the support of many, many individuals and colleagues who helped with everything from field data collection to technical details to just ongoing science advice. So this includes at the lower left there, the fire effects crew for Grand Teton National Park and Teton Interagency Fire, who helped with a lot of field data collection. And then of course my lab group at the University of Wisconsin is pictured at the upper right, always a good source of support. I'd also like to specifically thank Monica Turner, who is my advisor and a co-author on this project. She's been doing research in Greater Yellowstone for the past 30 years, which has really enabled our lab to develop such close collaborative relationships with folks in the region. And that's really how I got connected with Diane and was able to do this project with Grand Teton National Park. This presentation will have 3 distinct parts. I'm going to start off with just an overview of our approach for mapping canopy and surface fuels in forests and shrublands throughout Grand Teton National Park. There are many things you can do with this type of map. And for part 2, I'll turn it over to Diane, who's going to talk about some forest and fire management applications. Finally, in part 3, I'll use the fuels map to look at fuels and fire severity in the 2016 Berry Fire. This was the largest fire in Grand Teton National Park history, and it burned both mature, greater than 100-year-old, as well as relatively young subalpine forest in the area. Perhaps one of the key values of mapping a large forested landscape is really that we can now do a lot of different things. Some of these will be highlighted in parts 2 and 3. So we can ask many different questions about the causes and consequences of variation in structure and in fuels without doing a time-intensive field campaign to answer each one. And it's really emerging remote sensing tools that enable us to undertake these broad-scale mapping and analysis projects. So in our study, we capitalized on existing LiDAR, or light detection and ranging data, that was flown for Grand Teton National Park back in 2014. LiDAR is a type of active remote sensing data. It's depicted in this figure on the left. So in this figure, an instrument is shooting a laser, in this case from above. It is partially reflected by and partially able to penetrate the forest canopy. And each time that beam is reflected, it goes back to the sensor and it records the time, which essentially gives you the height at which it was reflected. So this LiDAR data gives us a 3-dimensional point cloud across a large area that gives that gives a complete vertical structure of that forest canopy. So we combined LiDAR with other data sources, in this case aerial imagery that was collected by the National Agriculture Imagery Program in 2015 in order to map fuels and forest structure across the park. This locally calibrated map can be particularly useful at updating products such as land fire, which has a national map, but by using locally sourced remote sensing data, we're able to provide an update of this map. However, these emerging tools are really only useful if they accurately represent the data that we're interested in. So for example, LiDAR gives us this really nice 3-dimensional point cloud that you can clearly see in the center here, represents a forest and the individual trees in that forest. However, that point cloud doesn't actually tell us what is the canopy fuel load or what's the canopy base height of that forested stand. So what we have to do is find a way to measure the fuels and then relate these back to the remotely sensed data in order to create our map. In addition, we faced a couple challenges for this particular study. We were working with LiDAR data that was 5 years old by the time we were undertaking field data collection. And at this point, the LiDAR data is considered actually low to medium resolution relative to what's being collected today. So together, this led us to ask the question, how well can LiDAR imagery fusion predict canopy and surface fuels for Grand Teton National Park? Now, when I say LiDAR imagery fusion, all that means is that I'm using LiDAR and imagery data together to jointly predict fuels. We expected that LiDAR imagery fusion would be able to better characterize metrics from the top of the canopy, so things like canopy cover and canopy height, but that we would have decreasing accuracy when trying to predict within canopy fuel metrics such as canopy base height, and lowest accuracy when predicting surface fuels such as coarse wood biomass. In order to answer this question, we started with a field data collection campaign in 2019. We used an existing vegetation map of Grand Teton, which is shown in the center here, and we focused on three main vegetation types: conifer forest, which is shown in green, deciduous forest, which is this darker brown color, and shrubland, which is the tan. So what we did is we took these different vegetation types and we designed a stratified random sample where we attempted to cover the entire range of canopy cover or shrub cover, as well as canopy height or shrub height, to really capture the full range of potential forest structure and shrub structure and fuels conditions throughout the park. So this resulted in us sampling a total of 43 plots. And it's important to note that there's a lot of good literature out there on the best sampling design for relating your field data back to remotely sensed data, and particularly back to LiDAR data. So a couple things I'll note that we did was we designed our plots as circular plots, and we used high precision GPS to take plot coordinates at the center. And it's the circle that really helps here because that takes a lot of the guesswork out of actually drawing the plot footprint in GIS software. It's much easier to just draw a circle around a center point than it is to figure out how to draw a square. We also measured the diameter at breast height of every single tree stem in that plot. And for trees of a certain size, we measured the canopy height and the crown height and the crown base height. And again, that was important to get the level of detail in our field data to match it up appropriately with LiDAR. We also measured cover of shrubs and trees that were less than 2 meters in height or 6 feet in height, and these together make up the surface fuel layer. So essentially we were extending a shrub intercept approach to include small trees, which allowed us to have a metric quantifying ladder fuels. And finally, we used Brown's transects to measure coarse wood. We then plugged our measurements of individual trees into the forest vegetation simulator in order to quantify canopy fuels. And we weren't actually simulating any stand development here. All we were doing was taking advantage of the forest vegetation simulator's species-specific standard allometric equations for these different trees of different sizes. So when we plugged our data into FVS, it gives us this vertical profile of canopy fuels shown in the center here. And from that vertical profile, we then are able to extract our fuel metrics at a stand scale. So things like canopy bulk density, canopy fuel load, canopy base height. We then used our circular plot footprint to extract the corresponding three-dimensional point cloud from our LiDAR data. So that's pictured here on the black background. You can see all those little points. They're color-coded from blue to lower heights to red at higher heights. And once we had extracted that circular point cloud, we then summarized it at the plot level with a variety of different statistics. Things like 99th percentile height, the number of first returns in the canopy layer, so that would be greater than 6 feet or 2 meters in height, mean, coefficient of variation, etc. We followed a similar approach with aerial imagery. So here we had from NAPE 4 spectral bands, red, green, blue, and near infrared. And we use these bands to derive the normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, as well. And again, once we extracted our circular plot, we calculated things like mean, max, standard deviation, etc. So between those, the LiDAR and the NAPE statistics were our predictors. And what we did was we used these predictors along with our dependent variable, which would be any given fuels metric, to fit multiple linear regression models to predict the fuel load from our LiDAR and imagery data. We performed model selection. So we identified the best model for each fuels metric based on goodness of fit using R² values, based on root mean squared error, and also based on the results of leave one out cross-validation. We only, for our final models, each of them had 5 or fewer predictors. That's because we really didn't have a whole lot of data and we wanted to avoid overfitting. And at the end of this process, a final model might look something like the example at the very bottom. So something where we've got the mean red value, 99th percentile height, the height coefficient of variation, and the standard deviation of NDVI are all going in as predictors in a multiple linear regression model that then predicts canopy fuel load at the plot level. All right, so that's our approach. How did we do? Well, as we were hoping and as we expected, we were able to predict canopy fuels with fairly high accuracy. So these 3 plots, canopy height, canopy fuel load, and canopy base height, we've got the observed values from our field data on the y-axis and our predicted values from our top models on the x-axis. The goodness of fit, R², and the root mean squared error are shown at the bottom. And so really what you see is that the models performed very well. 90+% of the variation was explained for canopy height and fuel load, and even our within canopy fuels metric, canopy base height, the model performed very well. Then we were surprised to see that our surface fuels were really predicted more strongly than we had initially expected. So here, in all cases, shrub and small tree cover, coarsewood cover, and coarsewood biomass, all of these models performed with 70% or better variance explained in almost all of our top models. And just a reminder that shrub and small tree cover are our way of quantifying ladder fuels. This will be important to remember later in the presentation. So here's a summary of the top models for all of the canopy and surface fuel characteristics that we mapped in forests. In addition to fuels, we also predicted tree density and basal area. One of the key points I want to highlight in this table are these columns where they're highlighted kind of yellow-orange. So these columns show us, was there a LiDAR predictor in the top model? And was there a imagery predictor in the top model? You can see in almost every single model, there was both a LiDAR and an imagery predictor. So really, all of these were best predicted by LiDAR imagery fusion, both of those data sources together. We also see our goodness of fit in the column at the far right. With the darker green is the higher goodness of fit, and generally consistent with what we were expecting. Top of canopy fuel metrics performed better with decreasing goodness of fit for within canopy and then for surface fuels in general, with some exceptions. We then used our top models to map these fuel loads throughout all of Grand Teton National Park at 30-meter spatial resolution. Here, for example, on the left is a map of canopy bulk density. That's just in the conifer forest, with low values are in the yellow, light green, and higher values are dark green. So one of the unfortunate things with our study is we don't have a data set to use for independent external validation. So what we did with our fuels maps, our final products, is we did a couple qualitative and quantitative assessments to see if we were capturing what seemed like realistic behavior in a realistic range of values. So here, for example, I've blown up this area that's on the shore of Jackson Lake. And what we're looking at is an area that burned in 2009 in the Bear Paw Bay fire. So remember, LiDAR was flown in 2014. So we'd expect this recent fire would have consumed a lot of the canopy fuels. And indeed, we see in this blow up, without even kind of having to draw the fire perimeter, a distinct line between an area of lower canopy bulk density and higher canopy bulk density. So we were seeing that this fuels map was capturing this trend we would expect. We also compared our field data, which again, we designed to kind of capture the full range of variation. So our field data shown in blue is a histogram compared to a histogram of our mapped values from the fuels map in red. And we use this comparison to assess were we within kind of the range of data we were expecting and were our values peaking at a similar place. In addition to mapping canopy fuels, we also mapped shrubland fuels. Shown here are shrub cover and sagebrush cover in percent, with low values are darker purple and high values are light yellow. And in addition, we mapped shrub height and percent dead in shrubland. Finally, we took a slightly different approach to mapping surface fire behavior fuel models, or FBFMs. FBFMs are categorical descriptions of surface fuels. They differ in the primary surface fuel, so things like grass, shrub, litter, coarse wood, or understory, in the fuel loading, and in the modeled rate of spread. So for Grand Teton, we started with the list of 40 surface FBFMs created by Scott and Bergen, and eventually narrowed it down to the 6 represented in these photos. These are grass 1 and 2 on the far left, timber litter 1 and 3 in the middle, and timber understory 1 and 5 on the right. We did actually initially have more surface FBFMs in our first cut, but we had to narrow down to these 6 because model fits performed poorly when we had more. We also added in a lot more data for this part. We had some photos that were taken at known GPS points in 2002 to 3. And so we used these, we classified these photos by FBFM, and we used these to supplement our 2019 field data, which gave us a total of 165 plots here. And then we used the same set of LiDAR and imagery predictors, but used a machine learning approach, random forest classification trees, to predict surface FBFMs. This model performed moderately well. The number of surface FBFMs that were accurately predicted are shown in the green diagonal cells in this confusion matrix at the lower left. And really, if it's green, that just means the prediction was correct. These are the results of a 5-fold cross-validation of our top model. And overall, the cross-validation accuracy was 68%. And the balanced accuracy, which is just the average accuracy across all of the categories, was 63%. So again, moderately well. Similar, kind of in a similar range as some of the R-squared values from our other surface fuel metrics. On the right is a graph of the importance of different predictors in the top model. So an important thing to note here is that in this measure of relative importance, correlated variables can share importance. So the order really shouldn't be overinterpreted here, but the key point is that vegetation type was an important predictor. We use that same vegetation type map when we were predicting FBFMs. And then we have a whole bunch of both imagery and LiDAR predictors that emerged in the top model. All right, so now we have a map. What are we going to do with it? I will turn it over to Diane, who will talk about some management applications.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to join in for a few minutes here to share some thoughts about how, as a fire manager, I see using these kinds of map products. So far, I have 4 ideas, and Kristen is going to help me with advancing the slides, and I'm ready for my first slide. The first is fire behavior predictions. I'm a fire behavior analyst myself, so I wanted to get my hands on this data and run some geospatial models on my computer. Next slide. At Grand Teton, our biggest fuels challenges come from these two situations. One is dense, continuous sagebrush that carries fire rapidly with flames over 30 feet tall. The other is torching and crowning conifer trees that spew burning embers that cause spot fires out ahead of the main fire and jump over roads, rivers, and fire lines. So knowing about the distribution of these fuels will help us use models to predict fire more accurately. Okay. Some of these geospatial models can be run on a PC, and the others live online in the IFTDIS and WFDIS apps. They all use the same kind of spatial fuels data Kristen was able to derive using LiDAR and imagery fusion. These are then combined with topography and weather inputs in model space. Next slide. Geospatial models use a special landscape data file with the extension .lcp. And these LCPs, as we call them, are made by combining 8 raster layers of topography, fuels, and canopy characteristics. The LiDAR imagery fusion model products are shown here in yellow, and the rest come from a DEM. So elevation, slope, aspect, fuel model, canopy cover, canopy height, canopy base height, and canopy bulk density. Next slide. Kristen's LCP on the left, which right now is showing the fuel model element, it's currently limited to the footprint of the conifer, deciduous, and shrubland vegetation types in the park. So to make a wall-to-wall LCP for simulated fires to spread on, we patched in land fire data, which is continuous over the entire US. The land fire data is served up online for fire modeling apps at a national scale, which is great, but it's usually not locally verified, and accuracy can be a bit of a mixed bag. But as Kristen said, next time Landfire updates its national LCP, we can provide our data to be incorporated in the next release. Next. I can also see us using this LiDAR fuels data for planning purposes. Okay. Here's an example. If we look at where the shrub, small tree ladder fuels intersect with high canopy bulk density and wildland urban interfaces, maybe we can identify and prioritize fuels treatments and design them for maximum effectiveness. This same process would work for wildlife habitat as well. Next slide. In the case of the park's sagebrush, I found that the shrub height data from LiDAR from the LiDAR imagery fusion really makes the thick, old mountain big sagebrush that is the best sage grouse nesting and winter foraging habitat. It makes it really pop out. These are the darker areas. These are the areas that our wildlife biologists have learned are just the most important for sage grouse. The shorter, lighter colored low sage on the west side of the river is not as desirable, but these differences don't show up on air photos. So I think this will help us manage this habitat. Next slide. Another way I see using LiDAR fuels data is for monitoring mechanical fuels treatments and fires. Okay. At Grand Teton, we use plot data to monitor the effects of our fuels treatments and prescribed berms on variables like woody fuel loading and canopy fuels. But this is an approach that might work as well. Kristen took her data from 30 randomized sample points inside and outside of this treated polygon and compared the data in the graphs you see here. For woody fuel loading, the purple treated bar shows the statistically lower tons per acre. Canopy base heights average higher, and the average canopy bulk density is lower. This is what we're going after, so that fire will be less likely to get up into the forest canopy in the treated environment. Next slide. Okay, back to the shrub height slide. You can see the polygon of shorter sagebrush in the bottom of the screen. This is a fire from 2003. And according to the 2014 LiDAR and the NAPE imagery data, the new sage plants are still not as tall as they were before the fire compared with the surrounding areas there. Sage grouse depend on tall plants to stick out of the snow in the winter. And I think LiDAR could help us learn how sagebrush recovers from fire and how long it takes. Next slide. All right, lastly, along these same lines, I see a number of opportunities to use these LiDAR-derived metrics to learn about fire ecology. So I'm going to pass the podium back to Kristen to give you an example from the 2016 berry fire.
Great. Thanks, Diane. All right, so part 3, go into the berry fire. So as a result of the fire season in 1988, large areas of Greater Yellowstone are really blanketed by relatively young, subalpine, largely lodgepole pine-dominated forest. Now, in some forest types, young forests can be thought of as fire breaks, or areas where relatively lower fuel loads act to slow fire spread or lower fire severity. However, recent work in our region quantifying forest structure and fuels in these young, subalpine, lodgepole pine-dominated forests, such as shown in this picture on the right, have shown that young regenerating forest stands can be characterized by really abundant canopy and surface fuel loads capable of supporting high severity crown fire. Now, mature subalpine forests in Greater Yellowstone generally have sufficient canopy and ladder fuels to allow for high severity fire. But fires have been historically relatively infrequent in this region, recurring every 100 to 300 years due to climate limitation. It really takes hot, dry, windy weather conditions, such as occurred in 1988 and again in 2016, to drive extensive severe fires. However, as we've seen, the climate is continuing to get generally warmer and drier in this region, and as that happens, we're seeing increasing area burned across the western US. So that's shown in this figure on the left, which has fuel dryness on the x-axis, and you can see that there's an exponentially increasing relationship with area burned on the y-axis. So as area burned increases, we also expect to see fires burning areas more frequently than they did in the past. And it's important in Greater Yellowstone to know whether these large extents of young forest will exhibit similar or different fire behavior compared to their mature counterparts. The 2016 berry fire in Grand Teton gave us an opportunity to contrast fuels and fire severity in young versus mature forest. These were areas where young and mature forest burned in the same fire, under similar weather conditions, and even on the same day. So the berry fire was the largest in Grand Teton National Park history, and 43% of the perimeter overlapped with recent previous fires that occurred either in 1987 or 1988, which is shown in the cross-hatching area that overlaps with this berry fire perimeter, or in 2000, which is shown as the diagonal lines that overlap with the perimeter. And the berry fire perimeter itself is outlined and includes the areas that are gray, yellow, orange, and red. So this forest that reburned was either 16 years old or approximately 30 years old, in addition to mature forest that was burning in this fire. In addition, the fire lasted over 2 months, but 75% of it burned under extreme fire weather, and that's the area that's yellow, orange, and red. And this fire weather occurred over just a 3 or 4 day period on August 22nd, 23rd to 24th, and September 11th. So using the berry fire as a case study, as well as now our newly created fuels map, we were able to ask, first, how do fuels and fire severity compare between young and mature forests that burned under similar fire weather? And second, how well do fuels and forest structure predict burn severity under moderate versus extreme fire weather? In comparing young versus mature forest, we only focused on the young 30-year-old forest and comparing that to over 100-year-old mature forest. This was because the reburns in the 16-year-old forest were either relatively small in area or occurred mostly in a different forest type than our focal subalpine lodgepole pine dominated forest. And based on recent studies of fuel loads in these young forests, we expected to see similar or higher fuel loads in young compared to mature forest and a lower canopy base height because those fuels would be concentrated closer to the ground. We also, based on recent work in the region where plots were sampled both in the 2016 berry fire as well as in the 2016 maple fire that reburned young forest up in Yellowstone National Park, we also expected similar or higher fire severity in young compared to mature forests. So in these berry and maple fire plots that were sampled in a project led by Monica Turner, this group found high severity fire, including severe surface fire, including crown fire, and even including what you see in this picture on the lower right, something that was deemed crown fire plus, in which there used to be a young forest there, but essentially all of the biomass was consumed by the fires. So an important part of this study design goes back to the fuels map, so we could use our fuels map to actually take a random sample of different cells in the map and that takes away the time, and use that for our fuels data, and that takes away the time of going out and designing a field data collection campaign or accessing difficult plots. Like we could really cover the full fire perimeter with our random sample of the fuels map. So for this question, we randomly sampled 30 cells, each in young and immature forest, and this sample only came from areas that burned under similar fire weather, so on those extreme fire weather days, just to reduce any differences that were solely due to weather conditions. We found that young and mature forest had similar canopy fuel loads as we expected, but a different vertical fuel profile. So here, for example, I've highlighted 4 different canopy fuels: canopy height, canopy fuel load, canopy bulk density, and canopy base height. These are box plots comparing the young forest in green with the mature forest in brown. And the difference between them, if it's statistically significant based on a Wilcoxon rank sum test, there will be asterisks showing that. And if it's not different, NS indicates not significantly different. So what we found is that young forests had lower canopy heights, which makes sense, similar canopy fuel loads, but higher canopy bulk densities, and then actually similar canopy base heights. So focusing in on canopy fuel load and bulk density, here now each of the points, the green points are from the young forest and the brown are from the mature, with canopy fuel load on the x-axis. And what you see here is that these 2 samples from the young and mature forest were covering a similar range of canopy fuel loads as we saw previously. But on the whole, the young forest had relatively higher canopy bulk densities, which is shown on the x-axis. So abundant fuels, but more densely packed into this shorter canopy. And this really makes sense for those of us who have had to swim our way through young lodgepole pine forests. They're full of short, small trees with lots of foliage that's concentrated close to the ground. So what did we see for fire severity? We saw no differences in fire severity between our samples of young versus mature forests. Both were capable of supporting severe stand replacing fire under these similar extreme fire weather conditions. And in both cases, approximately half of the area that burned was stand replacing fire based on a locally calibrated value for the region. And just a note, we quantified fire severity here with RDNBR. Right, so our second question went back to this idea of climate versus fuel limited fire behavior. So given that such a large proportion of the berry fire reburned young forest, could we possibly start to see a strong effect of fuels limitation in modifying or predicting fire severity, which might indicate a transition to a more fuel limited fire regime? So for this question, we asked how well fuels predicted fire severity, and we actually examined separately days of moderate fire weather versus days of extreme fire weather. So we again took a sample from our fuels map of 50 cells, each on moderate and on extreme days. And this time we included all burned areas. So this sample also included that young 16-year-old forest. And just a note that these extreme severity days were characterized by very dry conditions and high winds with average relative humidity of 28% and wind gusts of up to 80 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour. So given the abundant fuel loads in young forests, we did not expect to see a strong signal of fuels limitation. We expected fuels would generally be weak predictors of fire severity. And then we expected, if fuels are going to predict fire severity, we would expect these relationships to be logical. So higher fuel loads associated with higher fire severity. And we also generally expected that fuels might exert more control over fire severity under moderate weather conditions, whereas we thought under extreme conditions, weather would overwhelm the importance of fuels. So for answering this question, we used linear mixed effects regression models to predict fire severity, quantified by RDNBR. And we included as all possible predictors all of our continuous fuels metrics, canopy and surface fuels metrics from our fuels map. We excluded FBFMs. We included slope as a potential predictor just to account for the influence of topography. And then in this model, our random effect was the date that the fire occurred, which just served, in this case, as a proxy for differences in daily fire weather conditions. So here are our results. I'll walk through this table. Under moderate conditions, as expected, fuels were weak predictors of fire severity. So here, what we see on the far left are the variables that came out in our top models. These included canopy height, coarsewood biomass, basal area, and tree density. We actually had 3 competing top models, all of which had relatively weak goodness of fit, variance explained, from the fixed fuels metrics. So that's shown in this yellow-orange. That's the amount of variance explained solely due to fuels. So here, 12% in the top model, which included canopy height and coarsewood biomass. Now, if we look at the goodness of fit when we account for burn date as the random effect, that increases to 52% of variance explained by the model. So really, the key note there is that the burn date is explaining a whole lot more of what's going on with fire severity than these fuels metrics by themselves. Also, the predictors generally make sense as each of them increase, burn severity was predicted to increase. What was surprising for us was that predictions improved on extreme fire weather days. So now the top model was a function of tree density and our ladder fuel metric, shrub and small tree cover. And together, those explained 34% of the variation in our top model, and burn date was not important, so was excluded. So again, it's not particularly a strong model, but it does seem fairly convincing that the extreme weather model outperformed the moderate weather model in terms of how well the fuels predicted fire severity. So what's going on here? Well, one thought that we had was that extreme weather days represented a more consistent condition capable of just consuming all of the fuels. So maybe the more you had, the more you're likely to use, resulting in greater RDNBR. Another is that these more moderate conditions really represented a wider range of daily and even hourly weather conditions that were just much more influential in driving fire severity than fuels. Right, so in closing, just a few take-homes. We found LiDAR imagery fusion offers a really powerful approach for predicting and mapping canopy and surface fuels across a large forest landscape. The equations that we developed could potentially be used with other LiDAR and imagery data in similar forest types in the region, elsewhere in Greater Yellowstone or even the Northern Rockies, to predict forest structure and fuels. And the step-by-step approach we undertook is in general reproducible and transferable to other regions that want to collect their own data to map fuels. The data and code from our work will be available in a permanent repository when it's published, but feel free to also reach out to me via email. We saw that young forests have abundant fuel loads and can burn at similar severities as mature forests. Seems like in this case, at least these young 30-year-old forests that we examined really meet whatever threshold minimum fuel load is necessary to support severe fire. But they were interesting in their differences in vertical continuity of fuels in young versus mature forests. Same fuel loads, but more densely packed in these young forests. Finally, we did not find compelling evidence that fuels were strongly limiting fire severity in the Berry Fire, which reburned large areas of young forest. But we did find these interesting, stronger relationships on extreme weather days. And these equations that we fit could be particularly useful for providing a baseline of assessing how the relationships between fuels and fire severity are today and how they might change in the future. And they may allow us to see whether over time we start to see stronger influences of fuels limitation in these forests in this region. So with that, thank you very much. And Diane and I are happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks so much, Kristen and Diane. That was a great presentation, and I really appreciated the management perspectives as well as the research. So nice summary. We have a couple questions, and for those of you who might have more questions, please type them into the questions pane or the chat box on your screen. So the first question is going back to the modeling. Kristen, did you fit different models for different veg types? For example, one model for each metric for each of conifer, deciduous, or shrub?
Yeah, so yes, I fit. So there were some metrics that I fit for conifer forest only, and those were the canopy fuels, things like canopy fuel load, canopy bulk density. There were the forest structure metrics, tree density, basal area, as well as canopy cover and height. I combined deciduous and conifer forest together and fit those for all forest. And then everything that was in shrubland was a separate model and a separate fit.
Okay, thanks. And then I think this is going back to the fuel models. What is TU5?
That is timber understory 5. Generally, as the number increases, it stands for more fuels being in the understory. I don't know if Diane, you want to talk any more about TU5 in this region?
Well, I would say that it is it's the kind of the problem forest fuel with a lot of ladder fuels and a lot of ability to torch and cause spotting. And so that one is probably our heaviest one in forested areas.
Okay, thanks. And then looking at the LiDAR, you had better success predicting surface fuels than studies using LiDAR in the Pacific Coast states. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. I think I'm not sure exactly why this would be better than the Pacific Coast states in particular. I mean, I think that part of the study design of restricting to, doing these predictions in conifer forest, we were able to predict, like when imagery predictors and LiDAR predictors are being related to coarse wood, they are not always necessarily picking up the coarse wood by itself. They're picking up some of the canopy features that might be associated with different coarse wood biomass, for example, or coarse wood cover. And so I think that our models probably performed well because there were some consistent relationships between kind of the structural attributes that LiDAR and imagery were able to capture well and the surface fuel loads that were associated with them. I think that's part of the answer. There were some metrics, so the coefficient of variation of LiDAR was a particularly strong predictor was in some of the top models, which makes a lot of sense in terms of having a lot of points that might be close to the ground for coarse wood, as well as points that are high up in the canopy. But I think that that's a large part of why our models performed very well, is just that we kind of were characterizing a consistent forest type with similar relationships with coarse wood across its extent.
Okay, thanks. Another LiDAR question. It was surprising that LiDAR wasn't a predictor for canopy base height. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. And I think it's similar to the explanation I just gave. There were models that included LiDAR in predicting canopy base height. They just weren't the top model. And so again, I think that in this case, it was just some of those kind of imagery predictors that really enabled us to capture how much, how extensive kind of the canopy cover was, or imagery predictors that said that they gave us information on there is more biomass in this plot. I think those were just strongly associated with canopy base height. And so that's why they emerged in the top model.
Okay, moving into lodgepole. Historically, fire behavior in lodgepole was framed as LP0, a recent reburn, to LP4, with fire spread correlated to older forests. Does this research offer insights into how fuel may affect a more pure lodgepole stand in moderate versus extreme fire conditions?
Diane, do you want to start on that one?
That LP0 to LP4 fire regime model for lodgepole was developed in a time when we did not see as much fire on the landscape, and now that we do have increasing numbers of fires and are seeing maybe a more fire behavior happen on the ground, we're learning that maybe that model needs a little bit of adjustment to match what's happening with lodgepole. How's that for dancing around the answer?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, another LiDAR question. It seems like the 5-year LiDAR data produced good results. Is there any compelling reason to use more recent LiDAR data instead for future work?
Well, so the documentation that I followed when I was designing the field data collection campaign basically said as soon as possible you want to collect on the ground data. And as soon as possible was generally within 1 year was what was recommended. I think that's probably good practice. I'm not actually aware of studies that maybe have looked at 1 versus 5 year and really compared them head to head. I think in part it depends on how fast you might expect your fuels to change. So in conifer forests, growth is slow, so it was not necessarily that big of a deal. Maybe the biggest challenge for us is in working with this 5-year-old fuels data is that we actually had to, we're still kind of determining how to deal with areas that changed between 2014 and 2019. Right now in our first products, we've just masked out anything that was disturbed during that period, and it's not included in the final fuels map. And I think that's probably the biggest detriment of the 5-year gap, is that for the final product, we had to leave out areas that changed between 2014 and 2019.
Okay. Do you have a wish for a minimum number of points per square meter for future LiDAR collection efforts applied in this arena?
As many as possible. So our LiDAR data, when I said it was low to medium resolution, it was in the range of 1 to 5 points per square meter. And I think, gosh, I mean, they're in the 10s and 20s in data that's being collected today. And I think it would be great to collect data that's at the highest possible resolution.
All right, and this is a question for Diane, most likely. How would LiDAR collection and processing costs play into repeated implementation of this method? Is it feasible economically?
Well, if we did a LiDAR sampling at maybe a small project level, or even perhaps fire level, maybe not using an airplane, but using a drone or a backpack instead, I think that the costs could really come down. We would need to probably have someone hold our hand for the processing part, but we could be taught, and I guess I see a lot of promise in that department.
Okay, thanks, Diane and Kristen. I don't see any further questions at this point, so we'll go ahead and wrap things up. If you think of questions down the road, please feel free to email me and I'll get them, or Kristen or Diane directly. And again, once you close out the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we'd really appreciate your feedback as we use that information to identify future research needs for the region. So thank you all for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and enjoy the snow if you're in Western Montana.